Good evening, everyone. How are we? Cool. All right, we're doing good. If you don't know me, my name is Brian Howard. I'm one of the pastors here. Thank you. That means a lot. Hey, I was singing along in the back there, and we were singing that last song. And if you don't know what it's called, this is way too high. If you don't know what that song's called, it's called "I See Heaven," and it begins this way. It says, "I see heaven invading this place. I hear sounds of angels praising your holy name." And I was just sitting there listening to that, and I was thinking, like, how true is that song? I was thinking about what it actually says about heaven. It was one of the cool things. Maybe you're new, or, oh man, I'm sorry, I ran to the back. Here's why. I can explain. Here's what happened. I have two Bibles that look exactly the same because I always leave one somewhere. And so I grabbed the wrong Bible that didn't have like my little highlights on the way up. And so I had to run to the back. So anyone else out of shape? Hallelujah. Okay, so this is me. Okay, so we're singing this. And here's one of the cool things, especially if you're new to church. One of the crazy things about the Bible is this, that the Bible actually gives us a handful of times, not all the time, but a handful of times in the Bible, a vision of what heaven is like. And so the Bible actually gives us a vision. So when we sing songs like "I See Heaven," it's not just we're making up things we think heaven is like. The Bible actually gives us some snapshots of what heaven is like. And I want you to see one of those snapshots. It's in Revelation chapter 5. I didn't even get a slide, so you're just going to hear this. It says this, that there's tens of thousands times tens of thousands, which I don't do math, but that sounds like a lot of people. And they're screaming at the top of their lungs. And here's, again, it's heaven. Here's the vision. There's this God and all these people, tens and tens and tens of thousands, screaming, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive honor and power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise." And then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them singing, "To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be honor and glory and power forever and ever." And so I was just thinking about it while I was sitting back there going, okay, I see heaven and angels praising your holy name and people praising your holy name. And I was just thinking about this crazy fact that the Bible is telling us here that for all of eternity, what we just did in this moment is what we will do forever. Like forevermore, this whole act of us standing up and singing to Jesus, this whole act of us singing as a group, it goes on forever and ever and ever. And listen, I don't know what the worship band's like in heaven. I don't know if God's like, "Hillsong, you're up today," and then Jacob and Kylie and company, "You're up today." Like, I don't know how that all plays out in heaven, but here's what I'm certain of. This singing thing isn't some like random weird thing our church does. Singing is something right at the core of what it means to be a Christian. And here's my guess for most Christians I've ever spoken to, is that you love it. Like you don't just love God, you love the act of worshiping God. And tonight, here's what I just want to try to put before you. The fact that you don't just love God, you love the act of worshiping God isn't something to be embarrassed about, but rather something to be embraced. That the fact that we love the act of worshiping God isn't something to kind of push to the sides, but something to hold up as the center. Tonight, I want to talk about why YA loves worship. Why we love worship. And by the end of the night, here's what I hope you're confident in, that you love worship and I love worship because when we worship, God is glorified and we are satisfied. That God gets the honor and we get the joy. And those are two things that God wants for our church. And so if you have your Bible tonight, we'll be in Psalm chapter 95. If you want to pull it up on your phone, that's fine too. And we'll have it up here on the screen. But I want to walk through one of the most famous biblical texts on worship and try to show you that when we worship, God is glorified and we are satisfied. So here's how it begins. Psalm chapter 95, verse 1 begins this way. It says, "Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation." So Psalm chapter 95 begins with an invitation. Come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. This is how the text begins. Now, this is a really interesting text that I think challenges a lot of us and maybe how we grew up in church. Because what's really interesting about this is this text is going to tell us to sing, which is a command that we are to sing to the Lord, which is a command all of us can follow. But then I want to just show you the next one. It says, let us shout aloud to the joy of our salvation. But we're supposed to not just sing, but we're supposed to sing for joy. Meaning that this text is commanding joy in you. This text is commanding that not only do you sing to God, but you'd better like it. That's the command here, right? The command isn't sing to God whether you have a frown or not. The command is sing for joy. The command is sing and delight in it. Sing and actually enjoy it. Sing aloud, shout aloud to God, and you'd better like it. Which is this fascinating thing, right? Because sometimes in Christian faith, we get kind of mixed up on this whole emotion thing, right? Like the other week, just a few weeks back, I was speaking at this church and I was doing like a gospel invitation night. And before I went up on stage, the youth pastor grabs me and he goes, hey, I got to talk to you. And I said, okay, what's up? He goes, oh, you're doing an invitation. I was like, yeah, if you don't know what that is, it means I'm going to ask people to say yes to Jesus. And I was like, yeah, I'm doing that. And he goes, okay, here's the thing I need you to know. He goes, I don't want any emotional decisions tonight. I was like, okay, you don't want any emotional decisions. Now, in fairness to this guy, I know what he means. Like plenty of us have been at youth camp and you're like hyped out and you've been running around doing rec all week so you're exhausted and you've been eating like just full straight carbohydrates so you're not really thinking properly and you're exhausted and the preacher goes, who's in today? And you're like, I don't know, but I'm in for whatever. And you're just crying and you don't really know. So I get where he's coming from. And at the same time, he says, I don't want any emotional decisions for Jesus. And outside, you know how it's internal, external conversations. External, I went, I totally understand. And internal, I wanted to be like, what kind of idiot are you? Because here's why. I don't understand how you can make a decision for Jesus and have it not be emotional. I don't understand how you could say, Jesus has completely, through no merit of my own, forgiven me of my sins, died on the cross for me, and set me free for a life and eternity of joy in him. But I have no emotion toward that. I am just completely indifferent to that fact. Like it feels like sometimes in Christian faith what we want to say is just intellectually believe in Jesus and everything else is a side dish. And what I want to try to argue based on this text and thousands of other texts is that emotion is not a side dish to the Christian faith. It's right at the core. It is right at the core of what it means to be a Christian. In fact, I would go so far as to say this. If you're in this room and you call yourself a Christian, but following Jesus has changed nothing about your emotions, meaning you're not at more peace, you don't have more delight, you don't have more hope, nothing's changed about your soul, and you've been walking with Jesus for longer than like a week. If that's you and you're claiming nothing's changed about me, just intellectually I agree with Jesus, I would challenge whether or not you're actually saved. Because true trust in Jesus is going to result in a change in our emotions. It's going to result in a change not just in what we think, but how we feel toward God. The scriptures command us, delight yourself in the Lord, rejoice in the Lord always. These aren't sort of ethereal spiritual things. It's saying right at the core of your being what it means to follow Jesus and what it means to worship Jesus isn't just to think about Jesus or do things for Jesus, but it's to feel a certain way. And I'm not saying the feelings are the basis of your faith. It's your faith and your trust and confidence in Jesus that form the foundation. But that foundation should lead to a changed soul where you're able to shout aloud for joy, where worship brings up a certain amount of delight and joy inside of you. Because what I'm trying to argue tonight is that when we worship, God is glorified and I get satisfied. That God gets the honor and I get the joy. And what I want to try to point out to you tonight is that those two goals aren't in conflict. It's not like you have to choose either God gets glorified or I get satisfied. You get both. That's how it works. And sometimes we have this concern of like, I don't go to church to get something, I go to give something. And I just want to destroy that in you tonight. You come to church to get satisfied so that when you're deeply satisfied in God, he gets glorified. And those two things aren't in conflict, they fit together. Here's the way I would put it. So this last Thursday night, my wife looked at me, it was actually Wednesday night, and she goes, listen, I know I don't always say this, but whatever you want to do for date night this weekend, we'll do. Whatever you want to do. And I'm like, bingo. So Saturday night, we're at Chipotle, and we're eating our burrito bowls, and so we're eating our burrito bowls, and then we head over to golf and stuff in Ventura, and we play mini golf, and it's just like best date night ever. We have a blast, but I want you to imagine like that. Now, you get my wife up here. She's like, nah. But listen, I had a blast. But here's what I want you to imagine. I want you to imagine I come home from date night, and my wife walks through the door and goes, that was such an amazing night. Thank you so much for doing that. I just want you to imagine that I go, don't say anything. It's my duty. I don't know if I enjoyed it or not. I simply did it. Anyone want to join me on the couch tonight? Because that's where I'm going to be, right? But what if instead my response was, you know what, Danny, I had so much fun taking you out tonight. Like, it makes me so happy to take you out. Do you think if I said to her, it makes me so happy to take you out, that her response to me would be, you are so selfish. All you think about is your happiness. No, because here's what you all know, that your happiness, that your delight in something, that your satisfaction in something, and the honoring of that thing aren't two separate things, it's one. That the more I delight in my wife, the more she is honored, the more she is respected, the more she is lifted up. And if I don't honor, if I don't delight in my wife, I am not honoring her. And it's the same way with God. Listen, if you have this thing where you're like, I come to church just to give God praise and I get nothing out of it, I'd say you're missing out on everything that the Christian life has to offer. You're missing out on what it means to sing, not just to sing to the Lord, but to sing with joy. We love worship because God gets the glory and we get the joy, because God is glorified and we are satisfied. We love worship because those two things fit together. And then it continues on this way. In verse 2, it says, come, let us sing before him, or let us come before him with thanksgiving. So here's the thing I just feel obligated to say every time I preach on worship, that worship is more than singing. So Jacob said that earlier. It's true. Worship is more than singing. In fact, based on this text, here's what I'd say worship is. Worship is a response, a reaction to what God has already done. And so any moment in our life where we see what God has already done and we are grateful, we are thankful, that is a moment of worship. So when you woke up this morning and you made yourself a cup of coffee or went to Starbucks and got that cup of coffee and you said, man, it is just so good that coffee exists, that is a moment of worship. When you see a friend and you're just so blessed by that friend and you tell that friend, listen, I'm just so grateful for you. You're incredible. I'm just so glad you're in my life. That is you saying to God, I am so grateful that you created this person. That is worship. Worship is a posture of our heart that says all good and perfect gifts come from above. And I am grateful for that. I am thankful for that. So I don't want you to walk out of here tonight thinking that worship is just singing, but I want to be clear. Worship is more than singing, but it's not less. So when I talk about worship, I'm talking about more than singing, but I'm not talking about less than singing. In other words, you can't just say worship is more, worship is more than singing, and therefore singing is just not super important. Here's what I want to point out tonight, because it says this, it says, come, let us come before him with thanksgiving, and then the finishing of the sentence is, and extol him with music and song. So here's what I want to say. Worship is more than singing, but it's not less. In fact, I think I can make an argument from the Bible that right at the heart of what it means to be the people of God who worship is to be a people who sing. That every time we open up the scriptures and see those glimpses into heaven I was talking about earlier, every single time there are angels and human beings singing before God. That singing is right at the heart of what it means to be a Christian. I mean, any of you who have ever traveled overseas, especially to do mission work or see other churches all over the world. I have traveled to the slums of Uganda. I have traveled to a little beach city in Nicaragua. I have traveled to the jungle of the Dominican Republic. And everywhere I go, there are Christians singing. And listen, some of them are singing like old hymns in churches, and some of them are singing like with drums and nothing else, and some of them are singing with ripped knees in their jeans, and they're singing before crowds like this. But like, hear me on this, singing is universal. Singing is not unique to our context. Everywhere you go on the globe and you find people who love Jesus, you'll find a people who sing. Singing is right at the core of what it means to worship. Like, maybe you've never considered this. Singing is going to outlast almost everything else we do as a church. Like, maybe you've never thought about the fact that there will come a day that evangelism, sharing the gospel with people, goes away, because we'll all be in glory. Everyone will be with Jesus, seeing him face to face. There will be no need to make like arguments for Jesus. He's there. No more need for that. No more need for mission trips. There will come a day where teaching and instruction goes away, where I'm no longer like preacher man, right? Like, we're not gonna be in glory and God's gonna be like, Brian, your turn. And I'll be like, let's talk about Jesus. He's right there. You know, like, that's not going to be a thing in glory. And so as important as evangelism and teaching and using your spiritual gifts and all of these things are, there will come a day when all of those things cease and singing will remain. That for all of eternity, we will be a people that gather around the resurrected Jesus Christ, and we will sing together. Worship is more than singing, but it's not less. Worship is so much more than singing. But right at the core of what it means for our church to be is to be a people who hear the word of God and receive it and respond in song, respond in praise. That what we do here isn't just because we like singing songs and we've got a great band. It's because that's what the people of God do. It continues on this way, verse 3. It says, "For the Lord is a great God, the great King above all gods. And in his hands are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to him. The sea is his, for he made it, and in his hands he formed the dry land." So if you got your Bible, whether it's on your phone and you're taking little notes or highlighting things, or you've got it in your hand, circle this word "for." Anytime you're reading the Bible and you see the word "for" or "because" or "therefore," don't skip over those words. Look at them. Think about them. It says "for." It's giving us a reason. It's saying rejoice, sing to God, sing glad songs, be thankful, for this is the case, because this is the case. And the reason that the psalmist here gives that we are called to sing before God, worship him, glorify him, lift up our name, the reason we are called to glorify God is that he is the great King above all gods, and he owns everything. He owns everything, which means this: that your worship is not circumstantial. That your worship is not meant to be based on how well things are going in your life or in this world. That your worship is not based on how things are going in your life. Your worship is not based on how things are going in your family. Lord, help us. Your worship is not based on how things are going in the United States of America. Your worship is not based on circumstances. It's not based on situations. Your worship is based on the fact that God owns everything. It's all his. And you can cease to be a worshiping person in the moment that God ceases to own everything. That's when you can stop worshiping. Because the foundation, the basis of our worship is not the circumstance of your life, but the sovereignty of our God. Not the circumstance of your life, but the sovereignty of our God, that he owns everything, he created everything, that includes everything on earth, and that includes your life and your body and your future. Everything, it belongs to God. And because of that, we worship. And when we do that, and when we recognize that, God is glorified, and we are satisfied. It continues this way in verse 6. It says, "Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord, our God, our Maker." It says, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord, our God, our Maker. I think this is a command here that's suggesting something, that when we worship, it has to be expressed. Worship that is not expressed is not worship. In the same way that affirmation that is not expressed is not affirmation. If you think the person sitting next to you is pretty awesome, but you never actually say that out loud, you've never actually affirmed them. If you think something's great in this world, but you've never actually said it out loud, you haven't actually affirmed it. You haven't actually said it. It hasn't been expressed. My argument tonight is that in order for worship to be worshiped, it has to be expressed. That you can't just roll into this room and stand there completely unengaged and feel like you stood in a room where people were singing and therefore you worshiped. That's not worship. It's not worship until you express it. It's not worship until it comes out. And so on the one hand, I want to say that worship is not worship until it's expressed. And on the other hand, I want to make sure I'm being clear that worship being expressed isn't going to look the same way for everyone. In this text, you have two different things. There's let us bow down, which is going to be like flat on your face, face to the ground, and then let us kneel. And so you've got actually two different expressions playing out here. And I want to just try to be really clear that when we talk about worship being expressed, we want you, when you come in to this space on Thursday nights, and any place you go into where you are worshiping, where you are singing, we want you to express that worship, but we don't want you to feel like you have to express it in the way everyone else does. And so here's what I like to try to point out. If you have known me for any amount of time or just seen me preach for like 60 seconds, you will know that my hands never stop moving, right? It's a weird thing about me. I haven't tried. I won't ever stop. It's who I am. It's what I am. It's always going to be the case. And if you're like, oh, that's just a preaching thing, like, no, if you know me in life, when I am talking on the phone with someone, I'm alone, I'm doing this and talking to them with my hands. It's just a part of who I am. And so you got to imagine when I'm worshiping, typically my hands are up and they're up in the air because that's just how I'm wired. It's just what God's done to me. So for me, I can't actually be passionately worshiping unless my hands are moving. If you tied my hands behind my back, I'd break the ropes because I've got to move my hands. That's how I express my passion and love for God. So on the one hand, I am someone who raises my hands in worship. And then I want to tell this story. Just the other day, I was in a prayer meeting here at Calvary. And there was 4 or 5 of us in the room, and we were praying through the sheet. And I don't know if you guys know this, but when we do prayer requests here at Calvary and they get submitted to the church, we don't just sort of throw them in a drawer and forget about them. We actually pray over them. Weird, I know. And we do this every week, and we were reading through these prayer requests of people we didn't even know. And I prayed, and then this other lady sort of picked up where I left off, and she hit this line, and this person shared just a heartbreaking story. It was just a heartbreaking story. The person was anonymous. We don't even know who it was, but they were describing something just horrific that had happened in that family. And I read it and just went, oh man, that's heartbreaking. But this woman sitting to my left reads it, and she just starts sobbing. She just starts sobbing. So again, I'm here and just going, oh man, but this woman just starts sobbing. And I'm sitting there thinking of it, and I'm almost like, okay, well, I'm not crying right now. But then I had to realize, like, I'm just not a crier. And listen, I'm not saying that to sound like tough or cool. There's times I wish I would cry. Like, I get a hard time all the time when people ask about my wedding. They're like, when you were in the wedding and your wife was walking down the aisle, were you just crying? And I always have to look at them and be like, no, no, I'm sorry. Like, it was a really meaningful, beautiful moment. But there's these grooms who are just like sobbing, like that wasn't me. I was just like, yes, how'd this happen? Like that was me. Like, that was me while my wife. So I'm just not a crier. God hasn't wired me that way. And so it's just rare that in a worship time you would ever see me crying. And yet here's what I know. Some of you are criers. And I'm not saying that's it's awesome. Like, I think that's wonderful because God has wired you that way. And so for some of you, we'll sing a little later on in this service, and you'll just stand there and sob. But maybe some of you who would stand there and sob would never raise your hands into the air because that's just not how you're wired. And maybe some of you are like me, you would put your hands in the air, but you would never cry. Or maybe others of you, you like to have like a little bounce to your step when you're worshiping, and that's like an awesome thing. I just don't have the rhythm for that, so I don't do that. Or some of you like to clap, and I just get super insecure. I need like a choir on stage, and then I'm watching them trying to like sync up with this. So that's like some of you are gonna clap, and some of you are gonna bounce, and some of you are gonna just go full spinning mode, and like there's a whole thing. But here's what I'm saying. I want to try to point out that God has wired all of us differently so that you are called to delight in the Lord. You are called to be satisfied. Your worship is called to be joyful and passionate, but it's going to look different than the person sitting next to you. And so hopefully that does 2 things in you. The first thing is this. Hopefully that takes away any kind of judgment you might have for other people in this room. Like, especially those of you who are like me and you raise your hands. I think some of you have this thing where you're like, well, my hands are in the air, but yours aren't, so you must not believe what we're singing. Like, some of you are like doing nervous laughter because you're like, that's been me. And you think if all the hands in the room are in the air, it means everyone's worshiping. But if 60% of the hands are in the air, 40% of the people are going to hell. Like, that's what you think. And I just want to argue tonight that to understand that God has created us differently, to understand that we can bow down, that we can kneel, that we can clap, we can raise our hands in the air, we can just stand there and cry. For some of you, it's just the most passionate you get is that you just kind of nod your head a little bit. And I just want to say that there should be no judgment in this room of how someone else worships, just because you don't worship that way. You are called to passionately worship the Lord the way God's wired. So the first thing is that we're not going to judge, but then the second thing is that we're just not going to be afraid of how God's wired us. Like, there's this weird thing that happens in worship settings like this where you're worshiping, but then you're kind of concerned about what other people are saying. And, oh my gosh, are they looking at me? Are they thinking about me? And I probably said this to you before, but the best relief to the idea of what are they thinking about me is the glorious reality that no one's thinking about you. They're always thinking about themselves. And so you just get to worship and not worry what everyone across the room's thinking about you. It's just this liberating thing. And so if your hands are in the air, you're in the air, great. If you bring them down, you bring them down, great. I just need you to free up this need you have to try to be like cool in front of other people. Like some of you have this weird thing where you feel like you'd really love to just let go and worship, but there's that other guy sitting across the room and you're just kind of trying to impress him, or there's that girl over there and you haven't gotten her name yet, but you're going to tonight. You want to look cool and you have this like weird thing, and I just want to free you tonight to say that if you're going to be honest about how God has wired you to passionately worship him, you've got to have courage to just do that. And not to worry what the other people in the room think of you, not to worry what someone's going to say about you, to just simply say, I'm going to worship God to an audience of one because everyone else is in the room and I'm going to worship. And maybe your courage in lifting your hands, maybe your courage in dropping to your knees, maybe your courage in clapping along or doing whatever it is you need to do, perhaps your courage would free someone else up in this room to have courage to worship with reckless abandon. If you would do that tonight, here's what I promise you, that in the midst of you letting go entirely and saying, God, I'm here to worship, I'm here to sing, I'm here to glorify your name, God gets glorified, you get satisfied, I guarantee it. That's how worship works. That's why YA loves worship, because God gets glory and we get joy, because God gets honored and we get filled with his presence, filled with his spirit, and filled with a strength and a courage and a confidence and delight that no one in this world can touch. And so here's how we're going to wrap this up. Our band's going to make their way up. And I want to read to you this final verse. It says this. It says, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. So I want to remind you what we just saw. We just saw an entire chapter that tells us to come shout aloud for joy and sing to God and extol him with thanksgiving and music and song. Let us kneel before him in worship. Let us bow down in worship. It gives us this whole thing. And then at the very end, it says for, another reason, another foundation for our worship in God. It says for, he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. See, the greatest thing that should stir your worship, the greatest thing that should stir your heart when we start singing and stir your heart when we get into this room is the fact that he is our God and we are his people. That he is our God and we are his people, the flock under his care. In other words, the greatest thing that should stir your heart is the fact that you are a child of God, is the fact that you have been redeemed by God, you have been saved by God, you have been let into the family of God. This didn't just happen on its own. This didn't just happen because you were good. This happened because 2,000 years ago, Jesus hung and bled and died on a cross for you, to welcome you into God's family, to call you into God's care, that you would be his people and he would be your God. That the gospel is the ultimate foundation. The gospel is that which stirs us toward worship. It was a few years back, I was in the Boy Scouts, which you can laugh at me later for that, but I was in the Boy Scouts and we had this challenging camping trip where they gave us a challenge. They put us in groups of 4 and they hiked us to the top of the mountain and they put us on the mountain. They said, here's the challenge. You've got to light a fire and you've got to keep that fire going all night. It can't ever go out, but you're not allowed to talk. You can't say a single word all night, but the 4 of you need to keep this fire going all night. So we got this spark going and we started this fire. And we start this fire and we have it going and we had one mission, the 4 of us, all night. And the mission was this: find fuel, put it on the fire. Find fuel, put it on the fire. Find a log, put it on the fire. Find a stick, put it on the fire. Find fuel, put it on the fire. Find fuel, put it on the fire. And I wonder if anyone tonight needs to hear that God has started a fire in your heart, and he started a fire in our church, and that fire swells up in worship when we sing, and that fire swells up in worship when we raise our voices. And your job and mine in this life is to keep that fire going with one thing. It's to throw a log on the fire, and the log that God has given us is the gospel. It's the good news of Christ Jesus. It's the good news of the resurrection. It's the good news that we are his people and he is our God, and nothing changes that. Now